broken, kept promises. New York, 1917. Penelope Clark visited an old cemetery and found a tombstone with only a date, an inscription, "Here lies a hero, Private Samuel Quinn, his identity cloaked in mystery." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Cedarmere Cemetery. The wrought iron gates of Cedarmere Cemetery creaked open like the sigh of an old man, a mournful sound that always seemed to Penelope Clark to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. It was late October 1917, and the air held the crisp, melancholic scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. The wind, a restless wanderer from the Long Island Sound, rustled through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks, their leaves a tapestry of faded gold and crimson. Penelope pulled her wool coat tighter, the chill seeping into her bones despite the layers. She wasn't here for solace, not today. Today, she was here for answers. Penelope, at 62, carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered life's storms and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. Her silver hair, neatly tucked beneath a simple black hat, framed a face etched with the delicate lines of time and experience. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, held a depth that hinted at both a profound sadness and an unwavering resolve. She'd buried her husband, Thomas, here 5 years prior, a loss that still echoed in the quiet corners of her heart. But Thomas's grave, a stately granite monument, was not her destination today. She walked slowly, her steps measured and deliberate on the uneven path, past towering mausoleums and weathered headstones, each a silent testament to lives lived and lost. The names blurred: Van Rensselaer, Hawthorne, O'Malley, a roll call of New York's history, their stories whispered on the wind. But one name, or rather, the lack of one, had drawn her here. A simple, unassuming stone, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the cemetery, beneath the gnarled branches of a weeping willow. She found it just as the caretaker had described. A small, almost insignificant marker, made of a rough-hewn, gray stone. No grand pronouncements of love or loss, no poetic epitaphs. Just a date, deeply etched into the weathered surface. July 18th, 1916. And below it, a stark, poignant inscription. "Here lies a hero, Private Samuel Quinn." Penelope knelt, the damp earth cold and unforgiving against her knees. She traced the inscription with a gloved finger, the letters rough beneath her touch. Private Samuel Quinn. A hero. Unknown. Unremembered, except for the solitary, anonymous tribute. The anonymity gnawed at her. In a time of war, when casualty lists stretched endlessly, when young men were swallowed by the insatiable maw of the conflict in Europe, anonymity felt like a cruel injustice. Every soldier, she believed, deserved to be remembered. Every life, however brief, deserved to leave its mark.
"Who are you, Samuel Quinn?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. The wind seemed to carry her question away, scattering it among the silent stones. The date, July 18th, 1916, resonated with a particular horror. It was the height of the Battle of the Somme, a brutal, bloody stalemate that had claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. Had Samuel Quinn been one of those lost souls, mowed down in the mud and the wire of no man's land? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. But why was he buried here, in a quiet Long Island cemetery, so far from the battlefields of France? Penelope had first heard of the unmarked tombstone from Mrs. Abernathy, a fellow member of the local historical society. Mrs. Abernathy, a woman with a penchant for gossip and a surprisingly sharp memory, had mentioned it in passing, a curious anomaly in Cedarmere's meticulously documented history. A soldier, they say, Mrs. Abernathy had confided, her voice lowered conspiratorially. But no one knows who he was, or how he came to be here. A mystery, my dear, a proper mystery. The mystery had taken root in Penelope's mind, a persistent, nagging question that refused to be ignored. She'd always been drawn to the untold stories, the forgotten corners of history. Perhaps it was the historian in her, the ingrained desire to unearth the truth, to give voice to the silenced. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a connection to the countless women who, like her, had waited and worried, their hearts heavy with the fear of loss. She spent an hour in the cemetery that afternoon, lost in thought. She examined the stone from every angle, searching for any clue, any hint of identity. She looked for military markings, regimental symbols, anything that might connect Samuel Quinn to a specific unit. But there was nothing. The stone remained stubbornly, defiantly anonymous. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the graves, Penelope rose, her knees stiff and aching. She brushed the dirt from her skirt, a sense of frustration mingled with a renewed determination. She wouldn't let this mystery remain unsolved. She would find out who Samuel Quinn was, how he had died, and why he lay buried in this forgotten corner of Cedamere. She owed it to him. She owed it to all the forgotten soldiers, lost to the ravages of war. Leaving the cemetery, the iron gates clanging shut behind her, Penelope felt a familiar pang of loneliness. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that usually filled her with a sense of peace. But tonight, the beauty felt hollow, a stark contrast to the unanswered questions that churned within her. She walked towards the small cottage she had rented after Thomas's death, the image of the unmarked tombstone seared into her mind. The cottage was small but cozy, filled with the familiar comforts of a life well lived. Bookshelves lined the walls, overflowing with volumes on history, literature, and art. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow over the room. Penelope poured herself a cup of tea, the fragrant steam warming her hands. She sat in her favorite armchair, a worn, leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poetry resting on her lap, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of the young men marching off to war, their faces filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. She thought of the mothers and wives, their hearts breaking as they waved goodbye, knowing that some of those goodbyes might be forever. She thought of the letters, written in cramped handwriting, filled with tales of bravery and hardship, of longing and loss. Letters that often arrived weeks, even months, after the events they described. Letters that sometimes never arrived at all. And she thought of Samuel Quinn, the unknown soldier, the hero lying in an unmarked grave. His story, whatever it was, deserved to be told. She would be his voice. She would be his memory. She picked up a pen and a fresh sheet of paper, the blank page a silent invitation. The first step, she knew, would be the Cedamere Historical Society. They had records, archives, documents that might hold a clue. It was a long shot, but it was a start. The fire crackled, the only sound in the quiet room, as Penelope began to write, her pen scratching across the paper, a steady, determined rhythm in the gathering darkness. She had a mystery to solve, a soldier to remember. And she wouldn't rest until she had found the truth. It was the absence of a name that haunted, a gaping hole in the tapestry of remembrance. Chapter 2. A date etched in stone. The following morning dawned gray and blustery, the wind whipping the bare branches of the trees outside Penelope's window with a ferocity that mirrored the turmoil in her own thoughts. The unmarked tombstone, the stark date July 18th, 1916, had occupied her dreams, weaving itself into fragmented visions of battlefields and weeping women. She rose early, a sense of urgency driving her. Today, she would begin her search in earnest. After a quick breakfast of toast and tea, Penelope dressed warmly, choosing a sturdy tweed skirt and a thick wool sweater. She added a knitted scarf, a gift from her late husband, its familiar softness a small comfort against the chill. As she walked to the Cedamere Historical Society, housed in a charming, albeit slightly dilapidated, Victorian building on Main Street, she rehearsed her questions in her mind. The society was a haven for local history buffs, a repository of old documents, photographs, and artifacts that chronicled the town's past. Penelope had been a member for years, finding solace in the quiet pursuit of historical research. The familiar scent of old paper and dust greeted her as she entered, a comforting aroma that always felt like coming home. Mrs. Higgins, the Society's longtime archivist, a woman whose knowledge of Cedamir's history was surpassed only by her encyclopedic memory, looked up from her desk as Penelope approached. "Penelope, dear, what a pleasant surprise. Not researching another one of your fascinating articles on the early settlers, are you?" Penelope smiled. "Not today, Mrs. Higgins. I'm looking for information about a soldier." Mrs. Higgins raised a curious eyebrow. "A soldier? Anyone in particular?" "Yes and no," Penelope said, her voice hesitant. "I visited Cedamir's cemetery yesterday, and I came across an unusual tombstone. It's unmarked, except for a date July 18th, 1916, and the inscription, 'Here lies a hero, Private Samuel Quinn.'" Mrs. Higgins's brow furrowed. "Samuel Quinn? I don't recall that name. And an unmarked tombstone in Cedamere? That's unusual. Our records are quite thorough." "That's what I thought," Penelope said. "It's in the older section, near the Weeping Willow. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned it to me, and I became rather curious." Mrs. Higgins, ever the meticulous archivist, pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger from a shelf behind her desk. It was the cemetery's burial register, a painstakingly detailed record of every interment since its founding in the 18th century. She flipped through the pages, her finger tracing the entries, her lips moving silently as she scanned the names. Penelope watched, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The silence in the room was broken only by the rustling of the pages and the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Mrs. Higgins stopped, her finger resting on an entry. "Here it is," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "July 20th, 1916. A burial, but there's no name listed. Just unknown soldier." And a note, "Interred at the request of Mr. Elias Thorne." Penelope leaned closer, her eyes scanning the entry. Elias Thorne. The name was vaguely familiar. Elias Thorne, wasn't he? The mayor, Mrs. Higgins confirmed. Mayor of Cedamere for almost 30 years. A very influential man. Died in 1918 during the influenza epidemic. Penelope felt a flicker of excitement. A connection, however tenuous. "Do we have any records pertaining to Mayor Thorne? Correspondence, perhaps? Anything that might shed light on why he requested the burial of an unknown soldier?" Mrs. Higgins nodded. "We have a substantial collection of Thorne's papers. It's quite extensive. It might take some time to go through it all." "I have time," Penelope said, her voice firm. "And I'm willing to help." Mrs. Higgins smiled, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "I thought you might be. Let's get started, then." "The Thorne collection is in the back room. It's a bit disorganized, I'm afraid." The back room was a dimly lit, cavernous space filled with rows of shelves stacked high with boxes and files. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a testament to the years of accumulated history. Penelope felt a familiar thrill, the excitement of embarking on a historical treasure hunt. They spent the rest of the morning sifting through Thorne's papers. It was a daunting task. The collection was a chaotic jumble of letters, documents, receipts, and personal notes, spanning decades of Thorne's life and career. Penelope focused on the period surrounding July 1916, painstakingly examining each piece of paper for any mention of an unknown soldier, a burial request, or anything that might be relevant. Hours passed, and the initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of frustration. They found nothing. Letters from constituents, political speeches, financial records, but no mention of Samuel Quinn or the unmarked grave. Just as Penelope was about to suggest they break for lunch, Mrs. Higgins let out a small gasp. "Penelope, look at this." She held up a small, folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed and brittle. It was a letter, dated July 15th, 1916, addressed to Mayor Thorne. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried, the ink slightly faded. Penelope took the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words. "My dearest Elias, I write to you with a heavy heart, and a request that I know is both unusual and difficult. My son, Samuel, has fallen. He died a hero's death, serving his country. but circumstances prevent me from revealing his true identity. His burial must be discreet, unmarked. I know I can trust you, Elias. You were always a true friend to our family. Please grant me this one last favor. Arrange for his burial in Cedarmere Cemetery. A quiet corner, perhaps. No name. Just a simple marker. He deserves to rest in peace, even if his name cannot be spoken. I will be forever in your debt. With deepest sorrow, Eleanor Penelope stared at the letter, her mind reeling. Eleanor, Samuel's mother.
But who was she?
And why the secrecy? Why couldn't Samuel's true identity be revealed? The questions swirled in her mind, a tangled web of intrigue and unanswered mysteries. The date on the letter, July 15th, was 3 days before the date on the tombstone. The pieces were starting to connect, but the picture was still far from complete. A mother's plea, a secret burial, a hero's hidden identity. It was more than just a mystery, it was a tragedy, shrouded in the shadows of war. The letter felt like a fragile bird in her hand, its wings broken, its song silenced. Chapter 3. The Society of Remembrance. Eleanor. The name echoed in Penelope's mind, a whisper from the past, a key to unlocking the mystery of Samuel Quinn. The letter, clutched tightly in her hand, felt like a tangible link to a woman consumed by grief, forced to bury her son in secrecy. But who was Eleanor, and what were the circumstances that prevented her from revealing Samuel's true identity? Penelope and Mrs. Higgins spent the remainder of the afternoon poring over the Thorn papers, searching for any further mention of Eleanor, any clue that might reveal her identity. They found nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only this single, heartbreaking letter. It's strange, Mrs. Higgins mused, her brow furrowed in concentration. Elias Thorne was a meticulous record-keeper. He kept everything. Why wouldn't he have kept any other correspondence from Eleanor? Especially if she was a close friend, as the letter suggests. Penelope nodded, her own thoughts mirroring Mrs. Higgins's.
Perhaps he destroyed them, she suggested.
To protect her. To honor her request for secrecy. Perhaps, Mrs. Higgins conceded. But it still leaves us with a puzzle. We know Samuel Quinn was a soldier. We know he died on or around July 18th, 1916. We know his mother's name was Eleanor. And we know she requested an unmarked burial. But we don't know why. As the day drew to a close, Penelope felt a familiar wave of frustration. They had made progress, uncovering the letter, but it had only deepened the mystery. She thanked Mrs. Higgins for her help, promising to return the following day to continue the search. Walking home, the wind seemed to mock her efforts, whipping her hair around her face, stinging her eyes. She felt a growing sense of responsibility, a determination to uncover the truth, not just for Samuel Quinn, but for Eleanor, the grieving mother forced to bear her loss in silence. That evening, Penelope decided to take a different approach. She had exhausted the Cedarmere Historical Society's resources, at least for the time being. She needed to broaden her search. She remembered reading about an organization called the Society of Remembrance, a national group dedicated to preserving the memory of fallen soldiers. They had chapters in major cities across the country, including New York City. Penelope located their address in a directory and decided to visit their Manhattan office the next day. Perhaps they had records of Samuel Quinn, some information that might shed light on his identity and his service. It was a long shot, but she had to try. The following morning, Penelope took the train into the city, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a counterpoint to the anxious beat of her heart. The Society of Remembrance was located in a grand, imposing building near Union Square, its facade adorned with bronze plaques commemorating the various battles of the war. The interior was hushed and reverent, the walls lined with portraits of fallen soldiers, their faces staring out from the past, a silent reminder of the cost of war. Penelope approached the reception desk, her heart pounding in her chest. A young woman, her face pale and drawn, looked up from her work. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and polite. "Yes," Penelope said. I'm looking for information about a soldier. Private Samuel Quinn." The woman's expression didn't change. She simply nodded and turned to a large card index file. She flipped through the cards, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Penelope watched, her breath held captive in her chest. After what seemed like an eternity, the woman stopped, her finger resting on a card. She pulled it out and examined it closely. "Samuel Quinn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, we have a record of him, but it's incomplete. There's no date of birth, no place of enlistment, just a date of death. July 18th, 1916. And a notation. Circumstances unknown." Penelope felt a wave of disappointment. Another dead end. "Is there anything else?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Any information about his family? His unit?" The woman shook her head. "I'm afraid not. We rely on information provided by the military, and sometimes the records are incomplete, especially in cases like this, where there may be reasons for secrecy." Penelope's heart sank. Secrecy. It all came back to that. The same wall of silence that she had encountered in Cedarmere.
But why?
What was so sensitive, so dangerous, about Samuel Quinn's identity that it had to be concealed, even in death? The woman gave Penelope a sympathetic look. "I am so sorry, madam. I cannot disclose more." Penelope thanked her, trying her best to appear composed, and took her leave. Before she turned the handle, she caught one last glimpse of the portraits. She was beginning to hate the war even more. A secret so deeply buried it could erase a man from history, leaving only a date and a whispered title. Hero. Chapter 4. Letters from a Lost Battalion. The Society of Remembrance, while offering a glimmer of confirmation regarding Samuel Quinn's existence, ultimately reinforced the frustrating wall of secrecy surrounding his death. Penelope returned to Cedarmere feeling deflated, the city's vibrant energy replaced by a heavy sense of unanswered questions. The phrase "circumstances unknown" echoed in her mind, a taunt, a challenge. She decided to revisit the cemetery. Perhaps, standing at the unmarked grave, she might find some inspiration, some intuitive leap that would lead her forward. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, the air was crisp and cold, and the silence of Cedarmere felt heavier than usual, a palpable weight of unspoken stories. Penelope stood before Samuel Quinn's grave, the simple stone a stark contrast to the elaborate monuments surrounding it. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine him, a young man cut down in his prime, his life reduced to a date and a cryptic inscription. She thought of Eleanor, her grief compounded by the enforced secrecy. As she stood there, lost in thought, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, withered bouquet of wildflowers lay at the base of the tombstone. They were clearly not fresh, they were dried and brittle, their colors faded. But they were undeniably there, a silent tribute, a sign that someone, at some point, had remembered Samuel Quinn. Penelope knelt down, carefully examining the flowers. They were a simple assortment of field daisies and Queen Anne's lace, common wildflowers that grew abundantly in the Long Island countryside. They weren't the sort of flowers one would buy from a florist. They were the kind of flowers one might pick on a whim, a spontaneous gesture of remembrance. Who had left them?
And when?
Had it been Eleanor? Or someone else who knew Samuel's secret? The flowers offered a tantalizing clue, a hint that Samuel Quinn had not been entirely forgotten. The next day, Penelope returned to the Cedarmere Historical Society, her mind buzzing with a new idea. If the official records were incomplete, perhaps she could find information through unofficial channels. She decided to focus on the period surrounding Samuel Quinn's death, July 1916, and look for any local news articles, personal accounts, or letters that might mention the war, the Somme, or anything that might be remotely connected to Samuel's story. Mrs. Higgins, ever the resourceful archivist, suggested they start with the Society's collection of personal correspondence from Cedarmere residents during the war years. Many families had donated letters from their sons, husbands, and brothers serving overseas, offering a poignant glimpse into the lives of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances.
It was a painstaking task.
The letters were often handwritten, the ink faded, the paper fragile. Many were filled with mundane details of daily life, of homesickness and longing, of the simple yearning for the war to end. But some contained vivid descriptions of the fighting, the horrors of the trenches, the constant fear of death. Penelope focused on letters from the summer of 1916, specifically those mentioning the Battle of the Somme. She read of the relentless shelling, the mud, the blood, the unimaginable suffering. She read of the courage and resilience of the soldiers, their unwavering loyalty to their comrades, their desperate hope for survival. As she sifted through the letters, she felt a growing sense of connection to these young men, their voices echoing across the years. She imagined Samuel Quinn among them, facing the same dangers, enduring the same hardships. Late one afternoon, as she was about to give up for the day, she came across a small, battered box tucked away on a bottom shelf. It was labeled simply, "Letters from the Lost Battalion Cedemere Volunteers." Penelope's heart skipped a beat. The Lost Battalion. She had heard of them, a group of American soldiers who had been surrounded by German forces during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. They had held their position for days, against overwhelming odds, their bravery becoming a symbol of American resilience. But this box, it was labeled Cedemere Volunteers. And it predated the famous Lost Battalion incident. She carefully opened the box. Inside were dozens of letters, most of them dated from the summer of 1916. They were written by a group of young men from Cedemere who had volunteered for service early in the war, before the United States had officially entered the conflict. They had joined a British unit, eager to fight for the Allied cause. Penelope began to read. The letters were raw and unfiltered, filled with the youthful enthusiasm and naive idealism of young men going off to war. They wrote of their training, their camaraderie, their anticipation of seeing action. As the weeks progressed, the tone of the letters changed. The initial excitement gave way to a growing sense of disillusionment and fear. They wrote of the brutal reality of trench warfare, the constant shelling, the mud and the rats, the stench of death. And then, in late July, the letters stopped abruptly. There were no more letters from the Cedemere Volunteers. Penelope felt a chill run down her spine. The last letter was dated July 17, 1916, one day before the date on Samuel Quinn's tombstone. She carefully examined the names of the soldiers who had written the letters. There were a dozen names, all unfamiliar to her. But one name, listed at the very end of a roster attached to the first letter, caught her eye. Samuel Quinn, address withheld. Penelope stared at the name, her heart pounding. Address withheld.
Why?
Was this her Samuel Quinn? Was he one of the Cedemere Volunteers? One of the young men who had vanished in the summer of 1916? The discovery felt like a breakthrough, a significant piece of the puzzle falling into place. But it also raised even more questions. If Samuel Quinn had been part of this group, why had his name been omitted from the official records? Why the secrecy surrounding his death? And what had happened to the other Cedemere Volunteers? Were they all dead? Or were there survivors who knew Samuel's secret? The silence of the archives was broken only by the frantic beat of Penelope's heart, a rhythm of discovery and renewed determination. The Lost Battalion had yielded a whisper, a name, a connection. But the truth, she knew, was still buried deep, hidden beneath layers of wartime secrecy and forgotten memories. The box felt heavy in her hands, a repository of lost hopes and shattered dreams. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Black Tom Island. The discovery of Samuel Quinn's name among the Cedemere Volunteers, with the chilling addendum address withheld, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Penelope. It was the most concrete lead she had found, yet it simultaneously deepened the mystery. Why would his address be withheld? What was so sensitive about his background that it required such deliberate obfuscation? Penelope and Mrs. Higgins spent the next few days meticulously examining the Lost Battalion letters, searching for any further mention of Samuel Quinn, any clue that might shed light on his identity or the circumstances of his death. They found nothing. He was mentioned only once on that initial roster. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only his name and a lingering question mark. Frustrated, Penelope decided to shift her focus. She had been concentrating on Samuel Quinn's military service, his death on the battlefield. But the address withheld notation suggested a different line of inquiry. Perhaps the secret lay not in how he died, but in who he was before the war. She began to research the history of Cedamere in the years leading up to 1916. She delved into old newspapers, census records, and town directories, searching for any mention of a Quinn family, any clue that might lead her to Samuel's pre-war life. The search was slow and arduous. The name Quinn was relatively common, and she found several families with that surname living in the area. But none of them seemed to fit. There were no records of a Samuel Quinn of the right age, no mention of a family connection to Eleanor, the grieving mother from the letter to Mayor Thorne. Just as she was about to give up hope, she stumbled upon an article in an old issue of the New York Times, dated July 31st, 1916. The headline screamed, "Massive explosion rocks Black Tom Island. Sabotage suspected." Penelope's heart skipped a beat. Black Tom Island. She knew the story. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, a devastating act of sabotage that had rocked New York City and the surrounding area. Black Tom Island, located in New York Harbor, had been a major munitions depot, supplying the Allied forces in Europe with weapons and explosives. German agents, determined to disrupt the flow of supplies, had infiltrated the facility and planted explosives, triggering a massive blast that had killed several people and caused widespread damage. Penelope read the article with growing interest. It described the chaos and devastation, the investigation that followed, the widespread suspicion of German involvement. It mentioned the names of several workers who had been killed or injured, but there was no mention of Samuel Quinn. However, a smaller article, buried on a later page, caught her eye. It was a follow-up piece, focusing on the security measures at Black Tom Island prior to the explosion. It mentioned that security had been lax, with many workers hired without proper background checks. It also mentioned that a number of workers had been recruited from nearby towns, including Cedamere. Penelope felt a sudden surge of intuition. Could Samuel Quinn have been a worker at Black Tom Island? Could his death have been connected to the explosion, not the fighting in Europe? The date of the explosion, July 30th, 1916, was close enough to the date on his tombstone, July 18th, to account for the discrepancies of a chaotic and confused situation and delays in reporting. The address, withheld notation, suddenly made sense. If Samuel Quinn had been working at Black Tom Island, his family might have wanted to conceal his involvement, fearing reprisal or stigma. The explosion had been a major scandal, a black mark on the nation's war effort. And there had been widespread anti-German sentiment in the country, even before the U.S. officially entered the war. Penelope decided to investigate this new lead. She returned to the New York Times archives, searching for any additional information about the Black Tom Island explosion. She found dozens of articles detailing the investigation, the arrests, the trials. She learned that several German agents had been apprehended and convicted of sabotage, but the full extent of their network had never been fully uncovered. She also found a list of the casualties, the names of the workers who had been killed in the explosion. And there, buried among the names, she found it. Samuel Quinn. Age unknown. Address unknown. Penelope stared at the name, her heart pounding. It was him. She was sure of it. He hadn't died in the trenches of France. He had died in New York Harbor, a victim of sabotage, his death shrouded in secrecy and shame. This was not a battlefield hero in the traditional sense, but a casualty of a different kind of war, a war fought in the shadows, a war of espionage and deception. A new wave of questions flooded her mind. Was Eleanor aware of Samuel's work at Black Tom Island? Had she known about the danger? And why had she chosen to bury him in Cedamere, under an assumed identity? The explosion itself became a metaphor, a shattering of innocence, a revelation of the hidden darkness beneath the surface of wartime patriotism. Chapter 6. A Widow's Wreath and a Soldier's Secret. The confirmation of Samuel Quinn's death at Black Tom Island, while a significant breakthrough, opened a Pandora's box of new questions. The image of the young soldier dying in the trenches of France had been replaced by the reality of a civilian casualty, a victim of wartime sabotage on American soil. The hero inscription on his tombstone now seemed ironic, a poignant misdirection. Penelope felt a renewed urgency to uncover the truth, not just about Samuel's death, but about his life, his connection to Eleanor, and the reasons for the elaborate secrecy. She decided to focus on Eleanor, the grieving mother who had orchestrated the secret burial. If she could find Eleanor, she might find the answers she sought. She returned to the Thorn papers at the Cedamere Historical Society, hoping to find some clue to Eleanor's identity. She meticulously re-examined every letter, every document, every scrap of paper from the period surrounding Samuel's death. She found nothing. It was as if Eleanor had vanished into thin air after writing that single, heartbreaking letter to Mayor Thorne. Frustrated, Penelope decided to try a different approach. She knew that Eleanor had requested an unmarked burial, a quiet corner in Cedamere Cemetery. She reasoned that Eleanor must have had some connection to Cedamere, some reason for choosing that particular location. She decided to revisit the cemetery, this time focusing not on Samuel's grave, but on the surrounding area. She walked slowly, examining each tombstone, each inscription, searching for any name, any date, any clue that might connect to Eleanor. The older section of the cemetery, near the weeping willow where Samuel was buried, was a tapestry of faded glory, a testament to Cedamere's early families. Many of the tombstones were weathered and worn, the inscriptions barely legible. But Penelope persevered, her eyes scanning each stone, her mind racing. As she rounded a bend in the path, she noticed a small, unassuming tombstone tucked away beneath the branches of an ancient oak. It was partially obscured by overgrown ivy, almost hidden from view. She knelt down, carefully pulling back the ivy, revealing the inscription. Eleanor Thornton, beloved wife and mother. 1870-1917. Penelope's heart skipped a beat. Eleanor Thornton, not Quinn. The name was strikingly similar to Thorne, the former mayor. Could this be her? The dates were consistent. Eleanor Thornton had died in 1917, a year after Samuel's death. Had she succumbed to grief, unable to bear the loss of her son and the burden of the secret? Penelope noticed something else. A small, faded wreath of dried flowers lay at the base of the tombstone. They were the same type of flowers she had seen on Samuel's grave, field daisies and Queen Anne's lace. A wave of emotion washed over Penelope. It was almost certain. This was Eleanor, Samuel's mother. She had buried her son in secret, and then, a year later, she had joined him in the same quiet corner of the cemetery. The matching flowers were a silent testament to their bond, a mother's enduring love for her lost son. But the different last names Thornton and Quinn raised a new question. Was Samuel illegitimate? Had Eleanor been forced to conceal his true parentage? Or was there another explanation? Penelope decided to research Eleanor Thornton. She returned to the Cedamere Historical Society, and with Mrs. Higgins's help, she delved into the town's records, searching for any information about Eleanor's life. They found her marriage record. Eleanor Thornton had been married to Arthur Thornton, a prominent businessman in Cedamere. They had no children. Arthur Thornton had died in 1910, several years before Samuel's death. They also found a newspaper article from 1910 reporting on Arthur Thornton's death. It mentioned that he had left a substantial estate to his widow, Eleanor. It also mentioned that he had been a close friend and political ally of Mayor Elias Thorne. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Eleanor Thornton, a wealthy widow, a close friend of Mayor Thorne. Samuel Quinn, her son, but with a different last name. A secret burial, an unmarked grave. Penelope had a strong suspicion, a theory that began to form in her mind. She believed that Samuel Quinn was Eleanor's son, but not Arthur Thornton's. She believed that Samuel's father was someone else, someone whose identity Eleanor had been desperate to protect. And she suspected that someone might have been Mayor Elias Thorne. The different last names weren't a sign of illegitimacy, but a deliberate misdirection, a way to protect a powerful man's reputation. And the soldier? He was a pawn in their complicated game. The weight of the secret, the burden of the unspoken truth, felt heavy in the air. a suffocating silence that Penelope was determined to break. She was no longer just solving a mystery, she was uncovering a family tragedy, a story of love, loss, and betrayal, hidden beneath the veneer of wartime patriotism and social respectability. The widow's wreath and the soldier's secret were intertwined, two strands of a single, heartbreaking narrative. Chapter 7. The Hospital on Ellis Island. The theory that Mayor Elias Thorne was Samuel Quinn's father, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. Penelope needed proof, something more than circumstantial evidence and intuition. She decided to focus on the connection between Eleanor Thornton and Elias Thorne, hoping to find some concrete evidence of their relationship. She revisited the Thorne papers at the Cedamere Historical Society, this time searching for any personal correspondence between Elias and Eleanor, any hint of a romantic involvement. She found numerous letters, but they were all formal, business-related, dealing with town affairs and charitable donations. There was nothing that suggested a personal relationship, let alone an affair. Frustrated, Penelope decided to broaden her search. She knew that Elias Thorne had been a powerful man, a prominent figure in local politics. He had likely been involved in numerous organizations and committees, had attended countless social events. Perhaps there were records of him and Eleanor Thornton together, some public acknowledgement of their connection. She began to research Thorne's political career, his social activities, his involvement in the community. She spent hours poring over old newspapers, society pages, and meeting minutes, searching for any mention of Eleanor Thornton in connection with Elias Thorne. She found several instances of them attending the same events, the same charity balls, the same political rallies. But they were always listed separately as individual attendees, never as a couple. It was as if they had deliberately avoided being seen together, had carefully maintained a public facade of distance and formality. Just as she was about to give up hope, she stumbled upon a small, seemingly insignificant item in an old newspaper clipping from 1915. It was a brief announcement of a fundraising event for the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. The event was being held at the Thorne estate, and the guest list included both Mayor Elias Thorne and Mrs. Eleanor Thornton. Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. The name resonated with Penelope. She knew that Ellis Island had been the primary entry point for millions of immigrants arriving in the United States. But it had also housed a large hospital, treating those who were too ill to be admitted into the country. A sudden thought struck Penelope. Samuel Quinn had died at Black Tom Island, a massive explosion that had likely caused numerous casualties. Many of the injured would have been taken to the nearest hospital, which, in many cases, would have been the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. Could Samuel have been treated at Ellis Island before he died? Could there be medical records, some documentation of his injuries, his death? And, more importantly, could those records reveal anything about his identity, his family, his connection to Eleanor Thornton? Penelope decided to investigate. She contacted the National Archives, which held the records for Ellis Island. She explained her research, her interest in Samuel Quinn, and the Black Tom Island explosion. After several days of waiting, she received a response. The archivist informed her that they did have records from the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital, including patient logs and death certificates from the period surrounding the Black Tom Island explosion. However, due to privacy concerns, access to the records was restricted. She would need to provide proof of her relationship to Samuel Quinn, or obtain a court order. Penelope felt a surge of frustration. Another roadblock. She wasn't related to Samuel Quinn, and obtaining a court order would be a lengthy and complicated process. But then she remembered Eleanor Thornton. She was related to Samuel Quinn. She was his mother. And Penelope had found Eleanor's grave in Cedamere Cemetery. She had proof of Eleanor's existence and her connection to Samuel. Penelope contacted the archivist again, explaining her findings, her discovery of Eleanor Thornton's grave, her belief that Eleanor was Samuel Quinn's mother. She provided copies of the letter to Mayor Thorne, the newspaper articles about the Black Tom Island explosion, and the inscription from Eleanor Thornton's tombstone. After several more days of waiting, she received another response. The archivist informed her that, based on the evidence she had provided, they would grant her access to the relevant records. Penelope traveled to the National Archives in New York City, her heart pounding with anticipation. She was finally going to see Samuel Quinn's medical records, the official documentation of his death. The archivist led her to a quiet reading room where a thick file was waiting for her. It was labeled simply, Quinn, Samuel. Black Tom Island Explosion. July 30th, 1916. Penelope opened the file, her hands trembling slightly. The first document was a death certificate. It listed Samuel Quinn's name, age estimated at 22, cause of death multiple injuries, blast trauma, and place of death Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. The next document was a patient log, recording Samuel's admission to the hospital. It described his condition, his injuries, the treatment he had received. It was a grim, clinical account of his final hours. And then, at the very end of the log, she found it. A small, handwritten note, added by a nurse. Patient identified himself as Samuel Quinn. Stated his mother's name is Eleanor. Requested to see her. Unable to locate mother before patient expired. Penelope stared at the note, her eyes filling with tears. It was the confirmation she had been seeking. Samuel had spoken his mother's name, Eleanor, before he died. He had wanted to see her, to say goodbye. But there was one more document in the file. A small, folded piece of paper, tucked inside an envelope. It was a letter, addressed to Samuel Quinn, care of the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. The handwriting was familiar. It was Eleanor's. Penelope carefully unfolded the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and anticipation. She began to read. My dear Samuel, I received word of the explosion. I am frantic with worry. I am coming to the hospital as soon as I can. Please, my darling boy, be strong.
Hold on.
I will be there soon. With all my love, Mother. The letter was undated, but it was clear that Eleanor had written it before Samuel died. She had known about the explosion. She had known he was injured. She had been on her way to see him, but she had been too late. The letter was a testament to a mother's love, a desperate plea for a reunion that never happened. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the confirmation of Eleanor's identity, her connection to Samuel, her heartbreaking loss. The hospital, a place of hope and healing, had become the scene of a final, tragic separation. It was proof. Undeniable, heartbreaking proof. Chapter 8. Whispers Across the Atlantic. Eleanor's letter, found tucked within Samuel's hospital records, was a poignant confirmation of their relationship, a tangible expression of a mother's love and anguish. But it also raised a new, unsettling question. Why hadn't Eleanor been able to reach Samuel before he died? The letter indicated she was coming to the hospital as soon as I can. What had delayed her? What had prevented her from being at her son's side in his final moments? Penelope felt a renewed determination to uncover the full story, to understand the circumstances that had led to Samuel's lonely death and Eleanor's subsequent grief. She decided to focus on the timeline, the events of July 30th, 1916, and the days that followed. She revisited the newspaper accounts of the Black Tom Island explosion, meticulously piecing together the sequence of events. The explosion had occurred in the early hours of the morning, around 2:08 a.m. The blast had been massive, felt for miles around, causing widespread panic and chaos. Communication lines had been disrupted, transportation had been severely affected, and the city had been plunged into a state of emergency. Penelope realized that Eleanor, living in Cedarmere, Long Island, would have faced significant challenges in reaching Ellis Island. The trains would have been delayed, the roads would have been congested, and the ferries might have been suspended. It was entirely possible that she had been unable to reach the hospital in time, despite her desperate efforts. But Penelope also suspected there might be more to the story. Eleanor was a wealthy woman, the widow of a prominent businessman. She would have had resources, connections, influence. Surely, she could have found a way to reach Ellis Island if she had been determined enough. Penelope decided to investigate Eleanor's movements on the day of the explosion. She returned to the Cedarmere Historical Society, searching for any records that might shed light on Eleanor's activities on July 30th, 1916. She found nothing. It was as if Eleanor had vanished from the historical record on that day. Frustrated, Penelope decided to try a different approach. She knew that Elias Thorne had been the mayor of Cedamere at the time of the explosion. He would have been involved in the local response to the disaster, coordinating emergency services, communicating with city officials. Perhaps his records might contain some mention of Eleanor, some indication of her whereabouts on that day. She revisited the Thorne papers, this time focusing on the period immediately following the Black Tom Island explosion. She found numerous documents related to the disaster, reports from emergency responders, letters from concerned citizens, telegrams from city officials. And then she found it, a small, handwritten note, tucked inside a file labeled Black Tom Island Confidential. The note was dated July 30th, 1916, and it was addressed to Mayor Thorne. The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smudged. Elias, I must see you. Immediately. It's about Samuel. The explosion, I fear the worst. I cannot go to the hospital. You must go. Find out what happened. And if he's gone, you must arrange for his burial.
Discreetly. You know why.
Penelope stared at the note, her heart pounding. It was from Eleanor. She had contacted Thorne immediately after the explosion, expressing her fear for Samuel's safety. But the most significant part was the line, I cannot go to the hospital.
Why?
Why couldn't Eleanor go to the hospital to see her own son? What was preventing her? The note suggested a compelling reason, a secret so powerful that it overrode even a mother's desperate need to be with her dying child. Penelope realized that the secret likely involved Elias Thorne. He was Samuel's father, and his relationship with Eleanor was a closely guarded secret. Perhaps Eleanor feared that her presence at the hospital would expose their affair, would reveal Samuel's true parentage, would damage Thorne's reputation and political career. But there was something else in the note, something that hinted at a deeper, more complex reason. The phrase "you know why" suggested a shared understanding between Eleanor and Thorne, a secret that went beyond their personal relationship. Penelope began to suspect that Samuel's involvement at Black Tom Island might have been more than just a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps he had known something, had seen something, had been involved in something that made his death a matter of national security. She decided to expand her research beyond Cedamere and New York City. She knew that the Black Tom Island explosion had been an act of sabotage, carried out by German agents. She decided to investigate the German espionage network in the United States during World War I, searching for any connection to Samuel Quinn, any hint of his involvement in the events leading up to the explosion. She contacted a historian specializing in World War I espionage, Dr. Alistair Davies, a professor at a prestigious university in London. She explained her research, her findings, her suspicions about Samuel Quinn's death. Dr. Davies was intrigued. He informed Penelope that he had been studying the German espionage network in the U.S. for many years, and he had access to numerous declassified documents, including intercepted telegrams, surveillance reports, and interrogation transcripts. He agreed to help Penelope to search his archives for any mention of Samuel Quinn, or any information that might be relevant to her research. After several weeks of waiting, Penelope received an email from Dr. Davies. He had found something. He had discovered an intercepted telegram sent from a German agent in New York City to his superiors in Berlin, dated July 28, 1916, 2 days before the Black Tom Island explosion. The telegram mentioned a young man, SQ, working at the munitions depot. He has become a liability. He knows too much. He must be silenced. Penelope stared at the email, her blood running cold. SQ Samuel Quinn. The telegram confirmed her worst fears. Samuel hadn't been just an innocent victim. He had been a target. He had been murdered. The whispers across the Atlantic had revealed a chilling truth, a conspiracy that reached far beyond the quiet streets of Cedamere. Samuel Quinn, the unknown soldier, had been caught in a web of espionage and betrayal, his life sacrificed to protect a dark secret. The war had come home, not in the form of a returning hero, but as a silent, deadly threat. Chapter 9. The Cryptographer's Code. The intercepted telegram, revealing the German agent's intention to silence Samuel Quinn, confirmed Penelope's darkest suspicions. He had been murdered, not as a random victim of the Black Tom Island explosion, but as a deliberate target. He knew too much. But what did he know? And who, besides the German agents, wanted him silenced? Penelope felt a renewed sense of urgency. She was no longer just uncovering a family secret, she was unraveling a wartime conspiracy, a story of espionage and betrayal that had been buried for decades. She needed to find out what Samuel Quinn had discovered, what information he possessed that had made him such a threat. She returned to the Lost Battalion letters, the correspondence from the Cedemere volunteers. She had previously dismissed them as irrelevant, focusing on Samuel's connection to Black Tom Island. But now, she realized that they might hold a clue. She reread the letters, meticulously examining each word, each phrase, searching for any hint of Samuel's pre-war life, his interests, his activities. She noticed something she hadn't noticed before. Several of the letters mentioned Samuel's fascination with codes and ciphers. One letter, written by a fellow volunteer named Thomas Baker, described Samuel as a whiz with puzzles and codes. He can crack anything, they say. Spends hours poring over those strange symbols. Another letter, written by a soldier named William Carter, mentioned a game Samuel had invented, a complex code-breaking challenge that had stumped even the most intelligent members of the group. Penelope realized that Samuel's interest in cryptography might be significant. Could he have stumbled upon a German code, a secret message, something that revealed their plans for the Black Tom Island sabotage? Could his code-breaking skills have inadvertently led him to uncover the conspiracy, making him a target? She decided to investigate Samuel's interest in cryptography. She searched for any records of him taking courses in code-breaking, joining any cryptography clubs, or purchasing any books on the subject. She found nothing. His interest seemed to have been a personal hobby, a private passion. But then she remembered the address, withheld notation on the Cedemere volunteers roster. It suggested that Samuel had been concealing something, protecting his identity. Perhaps he had been working with codes and ciphers in a more official capacity, possibly for the U.S. government, even before he joined the British unit. Penelope contacted Dr. Davies, the historian in London, again. She explained her theory, her belief that Samuel Quinn might have been working as a cryptographer, possibly for the U.S. government. She asked him if he had access to any records of American code breakers during World War I. Dr. Davies was intrigued. He informed her that he did have access to some declassified documents from the British intelligence services, which had collaborated closely with their American counterparts during the war. He agreed to search his archives for any mention of Samuel Quinn, or any information about American cryptographers working in the New York area in 1916. After several days of waiting, Penelope received another email from Dr. Davies. He had found something. He had discovered a report from a British intelligence officer stationed in New York City, dated July 10, 1916. The report mentioned a young American cryptographer, working undercover, who had been providing valuable information about German espionage activities. The cryptographer was identified only by a code name, Nightingale. The report stated that Nightingale had recently uncovered a coded message, intercepted from a German agent in New York, that hinted at a planned attack on a major munitions depot. The report did not specify the location of the depot, but it emphasized the urgency of the situation, the need to identify the target and prevent the attack. Penelope's heart pounded as she read the email. Nightingale. Could this be Samuel Quinn? The timeline fit. The report was dated July 10, 1916, just weeks before the Black Tom Island explosion. And the description of Nightingale as a young, undercover cryptographer matched her understanding of Samuel's background and skills. Dr. Davies also included a copy of the coded message that Nightingale had intercepted. It was a series of seemingly random numbers and letters, a jumble of characters that made no sense to Penelope. But she knew that Samuel, with his fascination with codes and ciphers, might have been able to decipher it. She wondered if he had cracked the code, if he had identified Black Tom Island as the target of the planned attack. And if he had he reported his findings to his superiors? Had he tried to warn them? Penelope felt a surge of frustration. She had come so close to the truth, but she was still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. She needed to decipher the coded message to understand what Samuel Quinn had discovered. She printed out the message, staring at the jumble of characters, feeling overwhelmed. She had no experience with cryptography, no knowledge of code-breaking techniques. She had no idea where to start. But she knew she couldn't give up. She owed it to Samuel, to Eleanor, to uncover the full story, to expose the truth about his death. The code was a wall, a barrier between her and the truth. But she was determined to break it down, to unlock the secrets that Samuel Quinn had died trying to protect. He was more than a nightingale, he was a key. And she held the lock in her hands. Chapter 10. A Dance of Deception and Duty. The coded message, a jumble of numbers and letters, stared back at Penelope, a daunting challenge. She had no experience with cryptography, but she was determined to decipher it, to unlock the secrets that Samuel Quinn had died protecting. She knew that the answer to the Black Tom Island conspiracy, and perhaps the reason for the secrecy surrounding Samuel's death, lay within those cryptic symbols. Penelope began by researching basic cryptography techniques. She borrowed books from the library, searched online resources, and watched tutorials on code breaking. She learned about substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, and various other methods used to encrypt messages. She tried applying different techniques to the coded message, but nothing seemed to work. The numbers and letters remained a jumble, a meaningless sequence. She felt a growing sense of frustration, realizing the complexity of the task she had undertaken. Just as she was about to give up, she remembered something Mrs. Higgins, the archivist at the Cedamere Historical Society, had told her. Mrs. Higgins had mentioned that during World War I, many women had volunteered their services as code breakers, working for the government to decipher enemy messages. Penelope wondered if there might be someone in Cedamere, a descendant of one of those women, who might have inherited their skills or knowledge. She decided to put a notice in the local newspaper, asking for anyone with information about code breaking or cryptography during World War I to contact her. She received several responses, but most of them were dead ends. People shared stories of their relatives serving in the military, but none had any specific knowledge of code breaking. Then, one afternoon, she received a phone call from an elderly woman named Clara Winthrop. Clara was the granddaughter of a woman named Beatrice Winthrop, who had lived in Cedamere during World War I. Clara said that her grandmother had been a listener, working for the government to intercept and decode enemy radio transmissions. Penelope's heart skipped a beat. A listener. That was a term used for women who worked in radio intelligence during the war, intercepting and deciphering enemy communications. Could Beatrice Winthrop have known something about Samuel Quinn, about Nightingale, about the Black Tom Island conspiracy? Penelope arranged to meet Clara at her home, a charming Victorian cottage on the outskirts of Cedamere. Clara, a sprightly woman in her 80s, greeted Penelope warmly, inviting her into her cozy living room, filled with antique furniture and family photographs. Clara explained that her grandmother, Beatrice, had been a brilliant woman, fluent in several languages, with a natural aptitude for puzzles and codes. During the war, she had been recruited by the government to work as a listener, intercepting German radio transmissions from a secret listening station hidden in a nearby coastal town. Clara said that her grandmother had never spoken much about her work, respecting the secrecy of her mission. But she had kept a diary, a detailed record of her experiences during the war. Clara offered to let Penelope read the diary, hoping it might contain some information relevant to her research. Penelope accepted the offer with gratitude. She carefully opened the diary, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. She began to read, immersing herself in Beatrice Winthrop's world, a world of clandestine operations, secret messages, and the constant threat of discovery. Beatrice's diary entries described the challenges of intercepting enemy radio transmissions, the technical complexities of the equipment, the painstaking process of deciphering the coded messages. She wrote of the long hours, the intense pressure, the constant fear of making a mistake that could cost lives. As Penelope read, she noticed several entries that mentioned Nightingale, the code name for the young American cryptographer who had provided valuable information about German espionage activities. Beatrice wrote of Nightingale's brilliance, his dedication, his courage in working undercover to expose the enemy's plans. And then, in an entry dated July 25, 1916, 5 days before the Black Tom Island explosion, Penelope found it. A detailed description of a coded message that Nightingale had intercepted, a message that hinted at a planned attack on a major munitions depot. Beatrice had copied the coded message into her diary, along with her own attempts to decipher it. She had identified the cipher as a Vigenère cipher, a complex polyalphabetic substitution cipher that used a keyword to encrypt the message. Penelope recognized the coded message. It was the same message that Dr. Davies had sent her, the message that Nightingale had intercepted and that had been found in the intercepted German telegram. Beatrice had been working on deciphering the message, but she had not been able to crack it completely. She had identified the keyword as Kaiser, but she had not been able to determine the full plaintext of the message. Penelope realized that she had found the key to unlocking the code. With the keyword Kaiser, she could use a Vigenère square, a table used to decipher Vigenère ciphers, to decode the message. She carefully applied the Vigenère square to the coded message, using the keyword Kaiser to decrypt each letter. Slowly, painstakingly, the message began to reveal itself. The decoded message read, Black Tom. Midnight, July 30th. Destroy supplies. Confirm receipt. Penelope stared at the decoded message, her heart pounding. It was the confirmation she had been seeking. Samuel Quinn, Nightingale, had intercepted the German plan to sabotage Black Tom Island. He had known the location, the time, the objective. But the message also raised a new, disturbing question. If Samuel had known about the planned attack, why hadn't he been able to prevent it? Why hadn't he warned the authorities in time? It was a dance between knowing and not knowing. It was clear he had deciphered it. Why was he unable to act? Penelope was close. She could taste the final truth, but there was one last, crucial step to take. She had the message. She had the codebreaker. But something was still terribly wrong. Chapter 11. The Price of Silence. The decoded message, revealing the German plan to sabotage Black Tom Island, was a triumph, but it also presented a devastating paradox. Samuel Quinn, Nightingale, had known about the impending attack. He had deciphered the message, identified the target, the time, the objective. Why hadn't he been able to prevent the disaster? Why hadn't he warned the authorities in time? Penelope felt a renewed sense of urgency, a desperate need to understand the final, missing piece of the puzzle. She reread Beatrice Winthrop's diary, searching for any further clues, any hint of what might have happened after Samuel intercepted the message. She found an entry dated July 27, 1916, 2 days before the explosion. Beatrice wrote of receiving a frantic message from Nightingale, informing her that he had deciphered the German code and identified the target as Black Tom Island. He had requested an urgent meeting with his contact in the British intelligence service, a man named Captain Alastair Fairchild. Penelope's heart skipped a beat. Captain Alastair Fairchild. She had heard that name before. Dr. Davies, the historian in London, had mentioned Fairchild in one of his emails. He had described Fairchild as a brilliant but ruthless intelligence officer, known for his willingness to sacrifice anything, even his own agents, to achieve his objectives. Penelope decided to contact Dr. Davies again, asking him for more information about Captain Fairchild. She wanted to know about Fairchild's role in the Black Tom Island investigation, his relationship with Nightingale, and any actions he might have taken after receiving Samuel's warning. Dr. Davies responded quickly, providing a wealth of information about Fairchild. He confirmed that Fairchild had been Nightingale's handler, his primary contact in the British intelligence service. He also confirmed that Fairchild had received Samuel's warning about the planned attack on Black Tom Island. But then, Dr. Davies revealed a shocking twist. He had discovered a declassified document, a report written by Fairchild himself, dated August 1, 1916, 2 days after the explosion. In the report, Fairchild stated that he had received Nightingale's warning, but he had dismissed it as unreliable. He had believed that the German message was a deliberate deception, a ploy to divert attention from their true target. Penelope stared at the email, her blood running cold. Fairchild had ignored Samuel's warning. He had deliberately allowed the Black Tom Island explosion to happen.
But why?
What possible reason could he have had for sacrificing so many lives, for betraying his own agent? Dr. Davies offered a chilling explanation. He believed that Fairchild had been playing a double game. He had been secretly working with the German agents, providing them with misinformation, feeding them false leads, while simultaneously gathering intelligence on their operations. He believed that Fairchild had used Nightingale as a pawn, a sacrifice, to further his own agenda. He had allowed the Black Tom Island explosion to happen, knowing that it would create chaos and confusion, allowing him to manipulate the situation to his advantage. Penelope was horrified. Fairchild had betrayed Samuel, had condemned him to death, all for his own personal gain. He had used the war, the lives of innocent people, as a chessboard, sacrificing pawns to protect his king. She now understood the reason for the secrecy surrounding Samuel's death. Fairchild had needed to cover up his own involvement, to conceal his betrayal. He had used his influence to ensure that Samuel's true identity was never revealed, that his death was attributed to the explosion, not to his own deliberate negligence. Eleanor, knowing the truth, had been forced to remain silent, to protect Thorne's reputation, and perhaps to protect herself. She had buried her son in secret, an unmarked grave, a silent testament to a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power. The official story, the hero who perished in the explosion, was all a construct. Samuel's actions were not just those of a hero in death, but a conscious player, a knowing intelligence caught between a double agent and the enemy, sacrificed by those he should have been able to trust. Penelope felt a wave of anger, of grief, of profound sadness. Samuel Quinn, Nightingale, had been a true hero, a courageous young man who had risked everything to protect his country. But he had been betrayed, his sacrifice forgotten, his memory buried beneath a web of lies and deception. The price of silence had been his life. It became apparent that the true villain was not on the battlefield, but lurking within the very structures designed to protect. Chapter 12. Scars of the Somme. The revelation of Captain Fairchild's treachery, his deliberate sacrifice of Samuel Quinn, left Penelope reeling. She had uncovered the truth about Samuel's death, the conspiracy that had led to the Black Tom Island explosion, but the knowledge brought her no solace. It was a bitter victory, a testament to the dark underbelly of war, the betrayal and deceit that often lurked beneath the surface of patriotism and duty. Penelope felt a profound sense of sadness, a deep empathy for Samuel, Eleanor, and all those who had been affected by Fairchild's actions. She had solved the mystery, but the resolution was far from satisfying. She had brought Samuel's story to light, but she couldn't bring him back. She decided to take a break from her research, to step away from the darkness and the shadows of the past. She needed time to process her emotions, to come to terms with the tragic reality of Samuel's fate. She spent several days simply walking, wandering through the quiet streets of Cedemere, visiting the familiar places that had once brought her comfort. She walked along the beach, the sound of the waves a soothing balm to her troubled soul. She visited the cemetery, standing before Samuel's unmarked grave, and Eleanor's nearby, feeling a profound connection to their shared tragedy. As she walked, she thought about the war, the millions of lives lost, the countless stories of bravery and sacrifice, of love and loss. She thought about the young men who had marched off to battle, their faces filled with hope and idealism, only to be confronted with the brutal reality of trench warfare, the mud and the blood, the constant fear of death. She remembered the lost battalion letters, the correspondence from the Cedemere volunteers, the young men who had vanished in the summer of 1916. She had focused on Samuel Quinn, his connection to Black Tom Island, but she had almost forgotten about the others, the forgotten soldiers who had died in the trenches of France. She decided to revisit the letters, to read them again, this time focusing not on Samuel, but on his comrades, the young men who had shared his fate. She wanted to know more about their lives, their experiences, their hopes and dreams. She reread the letters, meticulously examining each word, each phrase, searching for any details that might shed light on their individual stories. She learned about their families, their friends, their sweethearts back home. She read of their fears, their doubts, their moments of courage and resilience. As she read, she came across a letter written by Thomas Baker, the soldier who had described Samuel as a whiz with puzzles and codes. The letter was dated July 15, 1916, just days before the Cedarmere volunteers disappeared. In the letter, Thomas described a harrowing experience, a brutal battle in which he had been severely wounded. He wrote of the relentless shelling, the mud and the blood, the screams of the dying. He wrote of being rescued by Samuel, who had dragged him to safety, risking his own life to save his comrade. Penelope's heart ached as she read the letter. Thomas Baker had survived the battle, but he had been left with permanent scars, both physical and emotional. He had returned to Cedarmere a broken man, haunted by the memories of the war. She wondered what had happened to Thomas Baker. Had he ever learned the truth about Samuel's death? Had he known about the Black Tom Island conspiracy, about Fairchild's betrayal? She decided to search for Thomas Baker to see if he was still alive or if he had any descendants living in Cedarmere. She contacted the local veterans organization, the American Legion, asking for their assistance. After several days of searching, they found him. Or rather, they found his obituary. Thomas Baker had died in 1960 at the age of 68. He had never married, had no children. He had lived a quiet, solitary life in Cedarmere, haunted by the memories of the war. But the obituary also mentioned something else. It stated that Thomas Baker had been a member of the Cedarmere Historical Society, a dedicated volunteer who had spent countless hours researching the town's history. Penelope's heart skipped a beat. Thomas Baker, the soldier who had been saved by Samuel Quinn, had been a member of the same historical society where she had begun her research. Had he known about Samuel's unmarked grave? Had he known about Eleanor's letter to Mayor Thorne? She realized that Thomas Baker might have known more about Samuel's story than he had ever revealed. He might have been protecting Samuel's secret, honoring his friend's memory by remaining silent. Penelope returned to the Cedarmere Historical Society, determined to find out more about Thomas Baker's involvement. She asked Mrs. Higgins if she remembered Thomas, if she knew anything about his research. Mrs. Higgins, her memory as sharp as ever, remembered Thomas Baker vividly. She described him as a quiet, reserved man, deeply affected by his wartime experiences. She said that he had been particularly interested in the history of Cedarmere during World War I, focusing on the stories of the local soldiers who had served overseas. Mrs. Higgins also remembered that Thomas Baker had donated a collection of his personal papers to the society shortly before his death. The papers were stored in a box in the back room, a box that Penelope had never examined. She and Mrs. Higgins located the box, carefully opening it, revealing its contents. Inside were dozens of letters, photographs, and documents, all related to Thomas Baker's life and his wartime experiences. And then, at the very bottom of the box, Penelope found it. A small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Thomas Baker's cramped handwriting. It was a diary, a personal record of his thoughts and feelings during the war. Penelope began to read, her heart pounding with anticipation. She knew that this diary might hold the final, missing piece of the puzzle, the answer to the questions that had haunted her for so long. The scars of the psalm, both literal and metaphorical, were about to be revealed, not in the grand narratives of battles and campaigns, but in the quiet, intimate voice of a soldier who had survived. The diary felt heavy in her hands, a testament to a life lived in the shadow of war, a life forever marked by the events of July 1916. Chapter 13. The Forgotten Promise. Thomas Baker's diary, a small, leather-bound notebook filled with cramped handwriting, offered a poignant glimpse into the life of a soldier haunted by the memories of war. Penelope began to read, immersing herself in Thomas's world, a world of trench warfare, camaraderie, and the constant fear of death. The early entries described the initial excitement and naive idealism of the Cedarmere volunteers, their eagerness to join the fight, their belief in the righteousness of their cause. Thomas wrote of his friendship with Samuel Quinn, his admiration for Samuel's intelligence, his quick wit, and his unwavering optimism. As the diary progressed, the tone changed. The initial enthusiasm gave way to a growing sense of disillusionment and despair. Thomas wrote of the horrors of the trenches, the relentless shelling, the mud and the rats, the stench of death. He wrote of the constant fear, the gnawing anxiety, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare with no escape. And then, in an entry dated July 16, 1916, Penelope found it. A detailed account of the battle in which Thomas had been severely wounded, the battle in which Samuel had saved his life. Thomas described the chaos and confusion, the deafening roar of the artillery, the screams of the dying. He wrote of being hit by shrapnel, feeling a searing pain in his leg, collapsing to the ground, unable to move. He wrote of lying there, bleeding, helpless, expecting to die. And then, he wrote of Samuel appearing through the smoke and the fog, dragging him to safety, risking his own life to save his comrade. Thomas wrote of Samuel's courage, his selflessness, his unwavering determination. He wrote of Samuel whispering words of encouragement, promising him that he would get him out of there, that he wouldn't leave him behind. Penelope's eyes filled with tears as she read the entry. It was a testament to Samuel's bravery, his loyalty, his profound humanity. He had been a true hero, not just in death, but in life, risking everything to save his friend. But the diary entry also revealed something else. It revealed that Samuel had made a promise to Thomas, a promise that he had been unable to keep. Thomas wrote, "Samuel promised me that he would tell my family what happened. He promised me that he would let them know I was alive. He promised me that he would come back." Penelope realized that Samuel's promise to Thomas might explain his actions after he deciphered the Black Tom Island message. He had known about the planned attack. He had identified the target, but he hadn't been able to warn the authorities in time. She believed that Samuel had been torn between his duty to his country and his promise to his friend. He had known that if he reported the Black Tom Island plot, he would be exposing himself as Nightingale, revealing his undercover work, putting his own life in danger. He had also known that if he didn't report the plot, countless lives would be lost, including his own. He had been faced with an impossible choice, a moral dilemma that had no easy solution. Penelope believed that Samuel had chosen to honor his promise to Thomas, to prioritize his friend's well-being over his own safety. He had likely tried to find a way to warn the authorities without revealing his identity, without exposing his undercover work. But he had failed. He had run out of time. The Black Tom Island explosion had occurred, and Samuel had been caught in the blast, his life tragically cut short. He had been unable to fulfill his promise to Thomas, unable to let his friend's family know that he was alive. Thomas, recovering in a military hospital, had likely believed that Samuel had died in the trenches of France, along with the other Sidemere volunteers. He had never known the truth about Samuel's death, about the Black Tom Island conspiracy, about Fairchild's betrayal. Penelope now understood the full extent of Samuel's sacrifice. He had not only given his life for his country, but he had also sacrificed his own reputation, his own legacy, to honor a promise to a friend. The forgotten promise, whispered in the heat of battle, had shaped Samuel's final days, had led him to make a choice that had ultimately cost him his life. It was a testament to his character, his integrity, his profound sense of loyalty. The promise, seemingly small in the grand scheme of war, became the defining act of Samuel's life, the reason for his silence, the explanation for his unmarked grave. It was a promise born of friendship, sealed in blood, and ultimately forgotten by everyone but the man who had made it. Chapter 14. Beneath the Poppy Fields. The discovery of Samuel's promise to Thomas Baker, a vow made amidst the chaos of battle, provided a poignant explanation for his actions, his inability to prevent the Black Tom Island explosion. He had been torn between duty and loyalty, between his country and his friend, ultimately choosing to honor a personal commitment, even at the cost of his own life. Penelope felt a profound sense of closure, having finally pieced together the puzzle of Samuel Quinn's life and death. She had uncovered the truth about the Black Tom Island conspiracy, Fairchild's betrayal, and the secrecy surrounding Samuel's burial. She had given voice to the forgotten soldier, the hero who had been silenced by the machinations of war. But there was one final task remaining. Penelope felt a strong desire to honor Samuel's memory, to ensure that his sacrifice was not forgotten. She wanted to find a way to commemorate his life, to tell his story, to give him the recognition he deserved. She decided to write a book, a detailed account of her research, her discoveries, and the tragic story of Samuel Quinn. She would title it The Unmarked Tombstone, a story of espionage, betrayal, and a forgotten hero. She spent months writing, meticulously crafting each chapter, weaving together the various threads of the story, from the whispers of Cedamere Cemetery to the intercepted telegrams, from Eleanor's heartbreaking letter to Thomas Baker's diary. She described Samuel's life, his fascination with codes and ciphers, his undercover work as Nightingale, his fateful decision to honor his promise to Thomas. She exposed Fairchild's treachery, his deliberate sacrifice of Samuel, his manipulation of the Black Tom Island investigation. She wrote of Eleanor, the grieving mother forced to bury her son in secret, her life forever marked by the loss and the silence. She wrote of Thomas Baker, the soldier who had survived the war, haunted by the memories of his fallen comrades, unaware of the true circumstances of Samuel's death. Penelope's book was a powerful indictment of war, a testament to the courage and sacrifice of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. It was a story of love, loss, betrayal, and the enduring power of friendship. When the book was finished, Penelope submitted it to a publisher, hoping to share Samuel's story with the world. The publisher was impressed, recognizing the historical significance of the story, the compelling narrative, and the emotional depth of Penelope's writing. The book was published to critical acclaim, becoming a bestseller, attracting widespread attention from historians, journalists, and the general public. Penelope was interviewed on television and radio, her story reaching millions of people. The publication of the book led to a renewed interest in the Black Tom Island explosion and in the role of espionage and sabotage during World War I. Historians re-examined the evidence, reassessed the official accounts, and acknowledged the long-overlooked heroism of Samuel Quinn. The Cedamere Historical Society, inspired by Penelope's research, created a permanent exhibit dedicated to Samuel Quinn and the Cedamere Volunteers. The exhibit included copies of the Lost Battalion letters, Thomas Baker's diary, and Eleanor's letter to Mayor Thorne. It also featured a replica of Samuel's unmarked tombstone, a poignant reminder of his sacrifice. Penelope, now in her late 60s, felt a sense of satisfaction, having finally brought Samuel Quinn's story to light. She had honored his memory, given him the recognition he deserved, and ensured that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. One day, Penelope received a letter from a woman named Sarah Collins. Sarah was the granddaughter of Thomas Baker's sister. She had read Penelope's book, and she was deeply moved by Samuel's story and by the revelation of his promise to her great-uncle. Sarah wrote that her family had always wondered what had happened to Samuel Quinn. They had known that he had saved Thomas's life, but they had never known the full story of his death. She thanked Penelope for uncovering the truth, for giving them closure, for honoring Samuel's memory. Penelope arranged to meet Sarah at Cedamere Cemetery, at Samuel's grave. They stood together, two women connected by a shared history, a shared admiration for a forgotten hero. Sarah had brought a bouquet of red poppies, the symbol of remembrance for fallen soldiers. She placed the poppies on Samuel's grave, a vibrant splash of color against the gray stone. As they stood there, Penelope thought about the poppy fields of Flanders, the battlefields where so many young men had lost their lives. She thought about Samuel Quinn, the soldier who had died not on the battlefield, but in a faraway city, a victim of espionage and betrayal. She realized that Samuel's story was not just a story of war, but a story of humanity, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of love and friendship. It was a story that deserved to be told, a story that would now be remembered, thanks to a chance encounter with an unmarked tombstone and a woman's unwavering determination to uncover the truth. The poppies, a symbol of remembrance, bloomed not just in Flanders, but also in Cedemere, a silent tribute to a hero who had finally found his place in history. Beneath the poppy fields, both literal and metaphorical, lay the truth, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be honored. Chapter 15. The Traitor's Kiss. The success of Penelope's book, The Unmarked Tombstone, brought Samuel Quinn's story to a wide audience, shedding light on a forgotten chapter of World War I history. The revelation of Captain Alistair Fairchild's treachery, his betrayal of Samuel and his manipulation of the Black Tom Island investigation, sparked outrage and calls for a re-evaluation of Fairchild's legacy. Penelope received numerous letters and emails from readers, expressing their admiration for Samuel's courage, their sympathy for Eleanor's grief, and their anger at Fairchild's actions. Many people were particularly interested in Fairchild, wanting to know more about his life, his motivations, and his ultimate fate. Penelope decided to delve deeper into Fairchild's background to try to understand the man behind the betrayal. She contacted Dr. Davies, the historian in London, again, asking for his assistance. Dr. Davies, intrigued by the public response to Penelope's book, agreed to help. He had access to extensive archives of British intelligence records, including personnel files, operational reports, and personal correspondence. He began to search for any information that might shed light on Fairchild's life and career. He discovered that Fairchild had come from a wealthy and influential family with a long history of military service. He had been educated at prestigious schools, had excelled in his studies, and had quickly risen through the ranks of the British intelligence service. He had a reputation for being brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless. He was known for his willingness to take risks, to bend the rules, to do whatever it took to achieve his objectives. He was also known for his charm, his charisma, and his ability to manipulate people to his advantage. Dr. Davies also discovered that Fairchild had been involved in numerous covert operations during the war, many of which were highly controversial. He had been accused of using unethical methods, of sacrificing his own agents, of collaborating with the enemy. But he had always managed to avoid any serious consequences, protected by his powerful connections and his reputation for getting results. As Dr. Davies delved deeper into Fairchild's past, he uncovered a shocking secret. He discovered that Fairchild had been romantically involved with a woman named Ilse von Hagen, a German spy who had been operating in New York City during the war. Ilse von Hagen was a beautiful and sophisticated woman, known for her intelligence, her charm, and her ability to infiltrate high society. She had been gathering information on American military and industrial activities, passing it on to her German handlers. Dr. Davies found evidence that Fairchild had met Ilse von Hagen at a social event in New York City, shortly before the Black Tom Island explosion. They had begun a passionate affair, meeting secretly, exchanging information, and plotting together. Penelope was stunned by this revelation. Fairchild, the British intelligence officer, had been having an affair with a German spy. He had been betraying his country, his colleagues, and his own agents, all for the love of a woman who was working for the enemy. The Traitor's Kiss, the entanglement of love and espionage, added another layer of complexity to the story. It explained Fairchild's willingness to sacrifice Samuel Quinn to allow the Black Tom Island explosion to happen. He had been protecting Ilse von Hagen, covering up her involvement, and furthering their shared agenda. Dr. Davies also discovered that Ilse von Hagen had been aware of Samuel Quinn's undercover work. She had known that he was Nightingale, that he had deciphered the German code, and that he posed a threat to her operations. She had likely been the one who had ordered Samuel's death, instructing her German contacts to silence him. Fairchild, blinded by his love for Ilse, had complied, betraying his own agent to protect his lover. The story became a tangled web of love, betrayal, and espionage, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of war. Fairchild and Ilse, two spies on opposite sides, had found themselves entangled in a passionate affair, their love a dangerous weapon that had cost Samuel Quinn his life. Penelope felt a renewed sense of anger and disgust at Fairchild's actions. He had not only been a traitor to his country, but he had also been a murderer, responsible for the death of a courageous young man. She wondered what had happened to Fairchild and Ilse von Hagen after the war. Had they been brought to justice? Had they faced any consequences for their actions? The kiss, a symbol of love, had become a symbol of death, a chilling reminder of the destructive power of betrayal. It wasn't just a betrayal of country, but a betrayal of the very notion of human decency, a corruption of love itself. Chapter 16. Echoes in No Man's Land. The revelation of Captain Alistair Fairchild's affair with German spy Ilse von Hagen added a chilling dimension to the story of Samuel Quinn's death. Fairchild, motivated by a twisted blend of love and ambition, had betrayed his country and sacrificed his own agent, all to protect his lover and further their shared agenda. Penelope, fueled by a desire to see justice served, was determined to uncover the ultimate fate of Fairchild and Ilse von Hagen. She continued her collaboration with Dr. Davies, the historian in London, who had access to extensive British intelligence records. Dr. Davies delved deeper into the archives, searching for any information about Fairchild and Ilse's post-war lives. He discovered that Fairchild had resigned from the British intelligence service shortly after the end of World War I, claiming ill health. He had retired to a secluded estate in the English countryside, living a quiet, reclusive life. He had never been officially charged with any crimes, his wartime activities protected by a veil of secrecy and his powerful connections. He had managed to escape any consequences for his actions, his betrayal of Samuel Quinn and his collaboration with the enemy remaining hidden from public view. But Dr. Davies also discovered that Fairchild had not been entirely forgotten. He had been haunted by the ghosts of his past, plagued by guilt and remorse. He had suffered from recurring nightmares, reliving the events of the Black Tom Island explosion, seeing Samuel Quinn's face, hearing his cries for help. He had become a broken man, his health deteriorating, his mind unraveling. He had died in 1935, at the age of 52, alone and unmourned. His death had been attributed to natural causes, but Dr. Davies suspected that it had been hastened by his psychological torment, his inability to escape the consequences of his wartime actions. As for Ilse von Hagen, Dr. Davies discovered that she had been arrested by the American authorities shortly after the end of the war, charged with espionage. She had been tried and convicted, sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but she had not served her full sentence. In 1923, she had been released from prison as part of a prisoner exchange with Germany. She had returned to her homeland, disappearing from public view. Dr. Davies searched for any further information about Ilse's life in Germany, but he found nothing. She had vanished without a trace, her ultimate fate unknown. Penelope was disappointed that Fairchild and Ilse had escaped any real justice for their crimes. They had lived out their lives in relative comfort, while Samuel Quinn had been robbed of his future, his memory buried beneath a web of lies and deception. But she also felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that Fairchild had been haunted by his actions, that he had not been able to escape the psychological consequences of his betrayal. His quiet, secluded life, his nightmares, and his early death were a form of punishment, a testament to the enduring power of guilt and remorse. Penelope decided to add a new chapter to her book, The Unmarked Tombstone, detailing the fates of Fairchild and Ilse von Hagen. She wanted to ensure that their story was told, that their actions were exposed, that they were not forgotten by history. The updated edition of the book was published, attracting even more attention than the first. The revelation of Fairchild's affair with Ilse von Hagen and their subsequent escapes from justice sparked widespread outrage and calls for a renewed investigation into their wartime activities. Historians and journalists began to re-examine the evidence, questioning the official accounts and demanding answers. The British government, under pressure from the public and the media, agreed to declassify more documents related to Fairchild's career, promising a full and transparent inquiry. Penelope, now in her 70s, felt a sense of vindication, knowing that her work had helped to bring the truth to light, to expose the dark underbelly of war, and to challenge the official narratives that had concealed the crimes of the powerful. One day, Penelope received a phone call from a man named David Miller. David was a researcher working for the British government, assisting with the declassification of documents related to Captain Fairchild. David informed Penelope that they had discovered a hidden compartment in Fairchild's desk at his former estate in the English countryside. Inside the compartment, they had found a collection of letters, photographs, and documents, all related to Fairchild's affair with Ilse von Hagen. Among the items, they had found a single, faded photograph. It was a picture of Fairchild and Ilse, taken in New York City, shortly before the Black Tom Island explosion. They were standing together, smiling, their arms around each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of love and defiance. And in the background, barely visible, standing in the shadows, was a young man. David Miller believed that the young man was Samuel Quinn. Penelope stared at the photograph, her heart aching. It was a chilling image, a visual representation of the tangled web of love, betrayal, and espionage that had cost Samuel his life. It was a reminder that even in the midst of war, human emotions, both noble and base, could shape the course of history. The echoes in no man's land, the whispers of the fallen, had finally reached across the years, revealing the full, tragic story of a forgotten hero and the traitors who had betrayed him. The photograph was a silent witness, a testament to a love that had destroyed, a betrayal that had echoed through the decades. Chapter 17. The Weight of a Silver Locket. The photograph, discovered in a hidden compartment of Captain Fairchild's desk, was a haunting artifact, a visual representation of the tangled web of love, betrayal, and espionage that had defined Samuel Quinn's final days. The image of Fairchild and Ilse von Hagen, locked in an embrace, with Samuel lurking in the shadows, served as a stark reminder of the forces that had conspired to seal his fate. Penelope, while deeply affected by the photograph, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had uncovered the truth about Samuel's death, exposed Fairchild's treachery, and brought his story to a wide audience. But she felt there was still more to do. She wanted to find a way to honor Samuel's memory in a more tangible way, to create a lasting legacy that would transcend the pages of her book. She decided to focus on the unmarked tombstone in Cedarmere Cemetery. It was a symbol of Samuel's forgotten sacrifice, a stark reminder of the secrecy that had surrounded his death. She wanted to replace it with a proper memorial, a headstone that would bear his name, his true identity, and a fitting tribute to his courage and sacrifice. She contacted the Cedarmere Cemetery authorities, explaining her research, her findings, and her desire to erect a new headstone for Samuel Quinn. They were supportive of her proposal, recognizing the historical significance of Samuel's story and the importance of honoring his memory. Penelope worked with a local stonemason, designing a simple but elegant headstone made of granite. She chose an inscription that reflected Samuel's true identity and his heroic actions: Samuel Alexander Thornton, alias Samuel Quinn. Nightingale, 1894-1916. A courageous young man who sacrificed his life to protect his country. He deciphered the enemy's code, but was betrayed by those he trusted. His memory will live on. Penelope also decided to include a small, engraved image of a nightingale on the headstone, a symbol of Samuel's code name and his role as an undercover cryptographer. The new headstone was installed in Cedarmere Cemetery, replacing the unmarked tombstone that had stood for so many years. A small dedication ceremony was held, attended by Penelope, Sarah Collins, the granddaughter of Thomas Baker's sister, David Miller, the British government researcher, and representatives from the Cedarmere Historical Society and the American Legion. Penelope spoke at the ceremony, sharing Samuel's story, his courage, his sacrifice, and the betrayal he had suffered. She spoke of Eleanor, the grieving mother forced to bury her son in secret, her life forever marked by loss and silence. She spoke of Thomas Baker, the soldier who had survived the war, haunted by the memories of his fallen comrades, unaware of the true circumstances of Samuel's death. Sarah Collins also spoke, expressing her family's gratitude to Penelope for uncovering the truth, for giving them closure, and for honoring Samuel's memory. She said that her family had always wondered what had happened to Samuel Quinn, the young man who had saved her great-uncle's life. Now, they finally knew the full story, and they were proud to call him a hero. David Miller shared some of the findings from the British government's investigation into Captain Fairchild's wartime activities. He said that the investigation was ongoing, but that they had already uncovered significant evidence of Fairchild's treachery, his collaboration with the enemy, and his deliberate sacrifice of Samuel Quinn. He promised that the British government would continue to pursue the truth, and that Fairchild's legacy would be re-evaluated in light of these findings. As the ceremony concluded, Penelope felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had done everything she could to honor Samuel's memory, to give him the recognition he deserved. The new headstone, a symbol of truth and remembrance, would stand as a lasting testament to his courage and sacrifice. Several weeks after the dedication ceremony, Penelope received a package in the mail. It was from David Miller, the British government researcher. Inside the package was a small, silver locket. David Miller explained in a note that the locket had been found among Captain Fairchild's possessions, in the same hidden compartment where the photograph had been discovered. The locket was engraved with the initials E.T., and it contained a miniature portrait of a young man. Penelope recognized the initials, E.T. Eleanor Thornton. The locket had belonged to Samuel's mother, and the portrait inside it was Samuel. Penelope held the locket in her hand, feeling the weight of its history, the emotional significance of its journey. It was a tangible link to Samuel, to Eleanor, to a love that had been tragically cut short by the ravages of war. She realized that the locket must have been given to Fairchild by Eleanor, perhaps as a token of their affection, a reminder of their secret love. Fairchild had kept it all those years, a memento of a relationship that had ultimately led to betrayal and death. Penelope decided to donate the locket to the Cedamere Historical Society, to be displayed alongside the other artifacts related to Samuel Quinn's story. She felt it was important for the locket to be returned to Cedamere, to the place where Samuel and Eleanor were buried, to the community that had finally embraced their story. The locket, a symbol of love and loss, became a powerful addition to the exhibit, a tangible reminder of the human cost of war, the enduring power of memory, and the importance of uncovering the truth, no matter how painful or how long it takes. The weight of the silver locket was not just the weight of the metal, but the weight of history, the weight of secrets, the weight of a mother's love and a son's sacrifice. It was a small, seemingly insignificant object, but it held within it the entire, heartbreaking story of Samuel Quinn. Chapter 18. A Revelation in the Rain. The silver locket, a tangible link to Eleanor Thornton and Samuel Quinn, added a poignant touch to the Cedamere Historical Society's exhibit. Penelope, having brought Samuel's story to light and secured his rightful place in history, felt a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had done all she could to honor his memory. However, life, as it often does, had one more surprise in store for her. One rainy afternoon, several months after the locket's arrival at the Historical Society, Penelope received a visitor. A woman, perhaps in her late 50s, stood hesitantly at the entrance, her eyes scanning the exhibits with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Penelope, volunteering at the society that day, approached her. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. The woman turned, her gaze meeting Penelope's. "I am looking for information about Samuel Quinn," she said, her voice slightly trembling. Penelope's heart skipped a beat. "I wrote a book about him," she replied, gesturing towards a display case containing the unmarked tombstone. "Perhaps you've read it?" The woman nodded. "Yes, I have. Several times. It's an incredible story. And it's my family story." Penelope was taken aback. "Your family story? How so?" The woman took a deep breath. "My name is Amelia Fairchild," she said. "Alistair Fairchild was my grandfather." Penelope stared at her, speechless. Amelia Fairchild, the granddaughter of the man who had betrayed Samuel Quinn, the man who had been responsible for his death. The irony was almost overwhelming. Amelia seemed to sense Penelope's shock. "I know," she said softly. It's a difficult legacy to bear. I've spent years trying to come to terms with it." She explained that she had grown up hearing whispers about her grandfather's past, rumors of his wartime activities, his involvement in some sort of scandal. But her family had always been tight-lipped, refusing to discuss the details. It wasn't until she read Penelope's book that she learned the full truth about her grandfather's treachery, his betrayal of Samuel Quinn, and his affair with Ilse von Hagen. It was devastating, Amelia confessed. To discover that the man I had always admired, the man my family had always held up as a hero, was actually a villain. She had spent the past few months researching her grandfather's life, trying to understand his motivations, trying to reconcile the conflicting images of the man she thought she knew and the man revealed in Penelope's book. She had come to Cedemere, she explained, to see Samuel Quinn's grave, to pay her respects, and to try to find some sense of closure. Penelope, despite her initial shock, felt a surge of empathy for Amelia. She understood the burden of a difficult family legacy, the pain of discovering uncomfortable truths about those we love. She offered to take Amelia to the cemetery, to show her Samuel's grave. Amelia accepted gratefully. As they walked to the cemetery, the rain began to fall harder, a steady downpour that soaked their clothes and blurred the landscape. The weather seemed to mirror the emotional turmoil of the moment, the weight of history, the legacy of betrayal. They reached Samuel's grave, the granite headstone gleaming in the rain, the inscription clearly visible, Samuel Alexander Thornton, alias Samuel Quinn. Nightingale. Amelia stood silently for a long moment, gazing at the headstone, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for what my grandfather did." Penelope placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It wasn't your fault, Amelia," she said gently. "You can't be held responsible for the actions of your grandfather." Amelia shook her head. "I know, but it's still a part of my history. It's a burden I have to carry." As they stood there, in the pouring rain, Amelia revealed something that Penelope had never expected. She said that her grandfather, in his later years, had become obsessed with cryptography. He had filled notebooks with complex codes and ciphers, spending hours trying to decipher them. It was as if he was trying to communicate with the past, Amelia said, trying to find some sort of redemption, some way to atone for his sins. She said that after her grandfather's death, her family had discovered a hidden room in his estate, a secret study filled with his cryptographic work. They had dismissed it as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but Amelia had always been curious. She had brought one of the notebooks with her, hoping that Penelope, with her knowledge of Samuel Quinn and his code-breaking skills, might be able to shed some light on its contents. Penelope, intrigued, agreed to take a look. They returned to the Historical Society, seeking shelter from the rain. Penelope carefully opened the notebook, its pages filled with Fairchild's cramped handwriting, a jumble of numbers, letters, and symbols. As she examined the notebook, she realized that Fairchild had been using a complex polyalphabetic cipher, similar to the Vigener cipher that Samuel Quinn had used to decipher the German message about Black Tom Island. Penelope spent hours poring over the notebook, trying to decipher Fairchild's code. She used the same techniques that Samuel had used, searching for keywords, patterns, and repetitions. Finally, as the rain subsided and the sun began to peek through the clouds, she cracked the code. The message revealed itself, a confession, a plea for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to communicate with the ghost of Samuel Quinn. The decoded message read, "Samuel, I betrayed you. I sacrificed you for my own selfish desires. I was blinded by love, by ambition, by the lies I told myself. I can never undo what I did, but I beg for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope that someday, somehow, you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I am haunted by your memory, by the knowledge of what I did. I live in darkness, and only your forgiveness can bring me light." Penelope stared at the decoded message, her heart aching. It was a tragic confession, a testament to the enduring power of guilt and remorse. Fairchild, in his final years, had been consumed by his betrayal of Samuel, his desperate attempt to atone for his sins. The revelation in the rain, the unexpected confession from beyond the grave, added a final, poignant layer to the story of Samuel Quinn. It was a reminder that even the most hardened hearts can be touched by remorse, that even the darkest secrets can eventually find their way to the light. The rain-soaked notebook, a testament to a traitor's guilt, became a symbol of redemption, a final, unexpected twist in a story that had spanned decades and crossed continents. Chapter 19. The Long Road Home. Fairchild's confession, deciphered from his cryptic notebook, brought a profound sense of closure to the story of Samuel Quinn. The revelation of his guilt, his remorse, and his desperate plea for forgiveness added a final, poignant layer to the narrative, transforming the image of the ruthless intelligence officer into a broken man haunted by his past. Penelope, having shared this final discovery with Amelia Fairchild, felt a sense of completion. She had uncovered the truth, honored Samuel's memory, and exposed the dark underbelly of wartime espionage. She had done all she could, and she could finally lay the story to rest. However, Amelia, burdened by the weight of her family's legacy, felt a need to do more. She wanted to find a way to atone for her grandfather's actions, to make amends for the harm he had caused. She decided to establish a foundation in Samuel Quinn's name, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. She would use her family's wealth, amassed in part through her grandfather's ill-gotten gains, to help those who had served their country, to honor the memory of the young man her grandfather had betrayed. Amelia asked Penelope to serve on the board of the foundation, to lend her expertise and her credibility to the project. Penelope, touched by Amelia's sincerity and her desire to make a positive impact, agreed. Together, they worked to establish the Samuel Quinn Foundation, creating a mission statement, outlining programs, and recruiting volunteers. They focused on providing support for veterans suffering from PTSD, offering counseling services, job training, and financial assistance. The foundation quickly gained recognition, attracting donations from individuals and organizations who were inspired by Samuel Quinn's story and by Amelia's commitment to atoning for her family's past. Penelope found a renewed sense of purpose in her work with the foundation. It was a way to channel her grief, her anger, and her sense of injustice into something positive, something that would help others. She often thought of Samuel, of Eleanor, of Thomas Baker, and of all those who had been affected by the events of World War I. She imagined them looking down with approval, their hearts filled with gratitude for the work that was being done in Samuel's name. One day, Amelia approached Penelope with a proposal. She wanted to organize a trip to France, to visit the battlefields of the Somme, where the Cedemere volunteers had fought, and where many of them had died. She wanted to trace the steps of those young men, to honor their memory, and to find some sense of connection to the past. She invited Penelope to accompany her, to share her knowledge of the war and of Samuel Quinn's story. Penelope, initially hesitant, eventually agreed. She realized that it was an opportunity to confront the ghosts of the past, to visit the place where so many lives had been lost, and to pay her respects to the forgotten soldiers who had fought and died in the mud and the blood of no man's land. They traveled to France, accompanied by a small group of veterans, historians, and descendants of the Cedemere volunteers. They visited the battlefields, the cemeteries, the memorials, walking through the silent landscapes where so much history had unfolded. They stood in the trenches, imagining the young men huddled there, facing the constant threat of death, their hearts filled with fear and longing. They visited the graves of the fallen, reading the names on the headstones, remembering their stories, honoring their sacrifice. They found the area where the Cedemere volunteers had fought, the place where Thomas Baker had been wounded, and where Samuel Quinn had promised to return. They stood there, in silence, feeling the weight of history, the echoes of the past. As they walked through the poppy fields, now blooming in vibrant shades of red, Penelope thought about Samuel, about his courage, his sacrifice, and his unwavering loyalty to his friend. She thought about Eleanor, her grief, her silence, and her enduring love for her son. She realized that the long road home, the journey to uncover the truth about Samuel Quinn, had finally come to an end. She had found closure, she had honored his memory, and she had helped to create a lasting legacy that would benefit others for generations to come. The trip to France was a cathartic experience, a way to confront the past, to honor the fallen, and to find peace. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can emerge, that even the most tragic stories can inspire acts of kindness and compassion. The long road home was not just Samuel's journey, but the journey of all those who had been touched by his story, a journey of remembrance, reconciliation, and healing. It was a journey that had begun with an unmarked tombstone and had ended in a field of poppies, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the resilience of the human spirit. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Memory. The journey to France, the pilgrimage to the battlefields of the Somme, marked a turning point for both Penelope and Amelia. They had confronted the ghosts of the past, honored the memory of Samuel Quinn and the Cedemere volunteers, and found a measure of peace amidst the landscapes of loss. Upon their return to Cedemere, Penelope felt a sense of completion, a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had done all she could to uncover the truth and to ensure that Samuel's sacrifice would not be forgotten. She had written her book, helped establish the Samuel Quinn Foundation, and participated in the creation of a lasting memorial. She decided it was time to step back, to retire from her active involvement in historical research and public life. She was in her 70s, and she wanted to spend her remaining years enjoying the simple pleasures of life, reading, gardening, spending time with friends, and reflecting on the extraordinary journey she had undertaken. Amelia, energized by her experience in France and by the success of the Samuel Quinn Foundation, continued her work, dedicating herself to supporting veterans and their families. She became a tireless advocate for those who had served their country, raising awareness of PTSD and other issues affecting veterans, and working to ensure that they received the care and support they deserved. The Cedemere Historical Society continued to thrive, its exhibit on Samuel Quinn and the Cedemere volunteers attracting visitors from around the world. The story of the unmarked tombstone, the forgotten hero, and the wartime conspiracy had resonated with people from all walks of life, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the importance of uncovering the truth. One day, several years after their return from France, Penelope received a letter from a young woman named Sophie Dubois. Sophie was a French historian, specializing in World War I. She had read Penelope's book, and she was deeply intrigued by the story of Samuel Quinn and the Black Tom Island explosion. Sophie explained that she had been researching the French involvement in the investigation of the Black Tom Island sabotage. She had discovered some previously unknown documents, letters and reports written by French intelligence officers who had been working with their American and British counterparts. She believed that these documents might shed new light on Samuel Quinn's role in the events leading up to the explosion and on the extent of Captain Fairchild's collaboration with the German spy, Ilse von Hagen. Sophie requested a meeting with Penelope, hoping to share her findings and to learn more about Penelope's research. Penelope, intrigued, agreed. They met at the Cedemere Historical Society, surrounded by the artifacts and documents that told the story of Samuel Quinn. Sophie presented her findings, explaining that the French intelligence officers had been suspicious of Captain Fairchild from the beginning. They had believed that he was playing a double game, that he was deliberately misleading them, and that he might be involved with the German agents responsible for the Black Tom Island sabotage. Sophie had discovered a letter written by a French intelligence officer, dated July 29, 1916, the day before the explosion. In the letter, the officer expressed his concerns about Fairchild, warning his superiors that Fairchild could not be trusted. He also mentioned that he had received information from a reliable source, an American cryptographer working undercover, who had identified Black Tom Island as the target of a planned attack. The officer had urged his superiors to take immediate action, to warn the American authorities, but his warning had been ignored. Penelope realized that the reliable source mentioned in the letter was Samuel Quinn. He had not only warned Captain Fairchild, but he had also tried to warn the French. He had done everything he could to prevent the disaster, but his efforts had been thwarted by Fairchild's treachery and by the bureaucratic inertia of the Allied intelligence services. Sophie's findings added another layer of complexity to the story, highlighting the international dimensions of the conspiracy and the extent of Fairchild's betrayal. They also reinforced Samuel Quinn's heroism, his unwavering commitment to protecting his country, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Penelope and Sophie collaborated on a new article, publishing their findings in a prestigious historical journal. The article generated widespread interest, prompting further research into the Black Tom Island explosion and the role of espionage during World War I. The story of Samuel Quinn, the forgotten hero, continued to resonate, inspiring new generations of historians, researchers, and storytellers. His legacy lived on, a testament to the enduring power of memory, the importance of uncovering the truth, and the courage of those who fight for justice, even in the face of betrayal and loss. The reckoning of memory, the final accounting of the past, was a continuous process, a journey of discovery that never truly ended. The unmarked tombstone had led Penelope on an extraordinary path, uncovering secrets, exposing conspiracies, and revealing the hidden heroism of a young man who had sacrificed his life for his country. And in the end, it was the memory of Samuel Quinn, the echoes of his courage and sacrifice, that remained, a lasting testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. It was a story that had begun with a question and ended with a legacy, a story that would continue to be told, to be remembered, and to inspire for generations to come. Epilogue. The years following the publication of Penelope and Sophie's article brought a quiet, reflective peace to Cedamere. The Samuel Quinn Foundation flourished, a living testament to the young man's sacrifice and Amelia Fairchild's dedication to honoring his memory. The Cedamere Historical Society, with its expanded exhibit on Samuel and the events surrounding Black Tom Island, became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the complexities of war, espionage, and the enduring power of individual courage. Penelope, now well into her 80s, found solace in her garden. The vibrant blooms a stark contrast to the somber hues of the cemetery where her journey had begun. She often walked to Cedamere Cemetery, not with the urgent quest for answers that had driven her initial visits, but with a sense of quiet companionship. She would sit by Samuel's headstone, now weathered by time, but still bearing its clear inscription, a testament to the truth she had painstakingly uncovered. She would also visit Eleanor's grave, often leaving a small bouquet of field daisies and Queen Anne's lace, the same wildflowers that had once marked a mother's secret grief. The connection between the two graves, once obscured by lies and deception, was now clear, a testament to a bond that even death and wartime conspiracy could not erase. Sometimes, Amelia Fairchild would join her. The two women, bound by a shared history and a mutual respect for Samuel Quinn, would sit in comfortable silence, the weight of the past a palpable presence, yet somehow softened by the passage of time and the knowledge that they had done their best to honor those who had been lost. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves of the ancient oaks and weeping willows turned to gold and crimson, mirroring the colors of the setting sun, Penelope sat alone by Samuel's grave. She had brought with her a worn copy of Tennyson's poems, the same book she had been holding on that fateful day when she first encountered the unmarked tombstone. She opened the book, her fingers tracing the familiar lines, her mind drifting back to the beginning of her journey, to the mystery that had consumed her, to the young man whose story she had felt compelled to tell. She thought of Samuel, not as the tragic victim of a wartime conspiracy, but as the young man he had been, intelligent, courageous, loyal, and deeply loved. She thought of Eleanor, her grief compounded by secrecy, her love for her son enduring beyond the grave. She thought of Thomas Baker, the soldier who had survived, carrying the physical and emotional scars of war, forever bound to Samuel by a forgotten promise. As she sat there, the wind rustling through the leaves, whispering the secrets of the past, Penelope felt a profound sense of peace. She had done what she had set out to do. She had uncovered the truth, honored Samuel's memory, and given voice to the silenced. She closed her eyes, the image of the unmarked tombstone fading, replaced by the image of Samuel's smiling face, the young man in the locket, the hero who had finally found his rightful place in history. The whispers of Cedamere Cemetery, once filled with mystery and sorrow, now seemed to carry a message of hope, a testament to the enduring power of remembrance and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the graves, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that, unlike that first evening, now filled her with a deep and abiding peace. The story had been told, the truth had been revealed, and the memory of Samuel Quinn, the forgotten hero, would live on. The cycle was complete.